So, as many media have been reporting, there is starting a dismantling of the Department of Education. Some people were saying it's already dismantled. Some people are saying no, no, no. He's just like sort of like putting it down a bit. There is a bit of a confusion. I think some of it is caused by the media itself, sort of over-reporting of what is actually happening. Some of it is sort of, I think, caused by Trump doing so much stuff at one time. We only have one mind to that we can focus on one topic at a time, and it's hard to sort of keep track on everything. But today we'll talk about the steps he is taking. If it really is that big of a deal as sort of would you would sort of hear from the first time you're hearing about it, and also we'll talk about some of the more principal things at the end, sort of what should actually happen when it comes to this stuff. Joining me today is James Valliant. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And yeah, I'll go to James to almost immediately. I'll just mention at the start, at least sort of what my understanding is right now, is that pretty much it is not really getting eliminated. Trump wouldn't really have the power to do so. It would still need to be Congress, but he has a lot of discretion, and he basically ordered one of his people through the executive order to basically not necessarily dismantle, but basically really reassemble the Department of Education to the extent of the law possible, or some wording like that was used. Basically, as much as you can do that, which is a very interesting thing to use. But for the most part, a lot of the things like the student debt or student loans were simply moved to different parts of the government, as well as so specifically those ones were moved to the Small Business Administration, and Department of Health and Human Services took over the special needs and the nutrition programs, which were set up. And of course, I think some time ago, like a week ago, Trump has already fired or got rid of like 50% of the staff at the Department of Education. So for the most part, this seems like we are just moving stuff, but nothing. There are some things that are being sort of shut down, but it doesn't really seem like that much is happening. James, what is your general overview of this?
Well, Mr. Trump, let's give Mr. Trump a little credit here. He actually has conceded that it takes an act of Congress to truly eliminate a whole department of government that was created by an act of Congress. And it's probably not doable under a reconciliation. So you need a full act of Congress subject to full Senate debate and filibuster and all that. And so just a little comment here to my Democrat friends out there. Were it not for the filibuster, the Department of Education might be ended by Congress by the end of this year. So I want all the Democrats out there to say a silent prayer of thanks for the thing they want to eliminate, the Senate filibuster, which is probably the thing that's going to save the Department of Education at the end of the day. And I don't like the Department of Education. At least Mr. Trump and his Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, have both said that we need an act of Congress to eliminate this department. Now, I think it's a pernicious department. It is invalid, immoral, unconstitutional. We can get into the technical parts of education later, as you say, the moral aspects of government being involved in education. But what they've done is basically taken most of the programs and shuffled them around. It's like, what is the old saying, moving deck chairs on the Titanic? American educational standards are abysmally low. Ayn Rand published a collection of essays in the 1960s called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And in the article, the short article on public education in that book, it wasn't written by Ayn Rand, but someone else, they noted in the 1960s, mind you, the abysmal state of American education. Now, since the 1960s, and since I went to university in the 1980s, I can tell you, even in that time, American education has gone into the sewer. It is so abysmal. We have some of the worst public education on the planet. For an industrialized nation, it is a shame. It is an embarrassing shame, the condition of American schools. It really is. But basically, as you point out, they've just taken programs. For example, programs about civil rights protections can be moved over to the Justice Department. Programs of student loan programs might be able to be moved to the Small Business Administration or to the Treasury Department. And he's asking through his executive order to do as much, as you point out, as they can do in terms of moving programs out. The big problem is they're not removing most of the programs. They're preserving most of what the Department of Education does. They're just moving it to other departments like Justice or Treasury or the Small Business Administration, which is under Commerce, I think. So all they're doing is shuffling it about. Insofar as it is an abstract statement that the federal government shouldn't be involved. Indeed, government shouldn't be involved in education. It's a step, I guess, a micro step in the right direction in terms of divide and conquer on the programs. But the programs remain. And I'd back up to say something else. My main issue with Trump's Department of Government Efficiency is that it's revealed right there in that word, term, government efficiency. They don't want to eliminate any major programs. Well, what they really want to do is give us more efficient government, more cost effective, less bureaucratic. But the program itself is not being questioned. We need to question the policy itself, the program itself. Should the government be subsidizing higher education through Pell Grants and student loans, or direct subsidies to universities? Should the government be involved in even special needs cases? Now, I might say that in programs like special needs, you don't want to phase it out as opposed to eliminating it overnight, but still, I'm opposed to the programs themselves. And what Mr. Trump and Mrs. McMahon are not doing are going out arguing against the program. There should be no subsidies to universities. There should be no federal involvement in education. They don't take that position. They just say, well, let's just move the programs around. And like I say, it's deck chairs on the Titanic when you look at how disastrous the American educational system has become over the years. I mean, it's really embarrassingly bad.
Yeah, and sort of talking about the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, it sort of actually now reminded me of one of the things sort of my favorite party in Slovakia did, but they did it in parliament. They basically, whenever there was a new law being passed or a sort of, well, we don't really do sort of like the giant bills that you do in America, but sort of when laws being passed, what they did is they did this, they called it kilečko, which means like a kilogram. It was basically like 100 small things that basically like removing regulation. And anytime a law was passed, they just threw that in. It was voted on. It was passed, and basically that was sort of a way to get rid of like some of the things. And yeah, when you really think about it, it might be worth moving that department to Congress. That might be a more appropriate spot for it to be, because fundamentally that's where, and also it needs to be staff being cut down. Even the idea that, I mean, originally I think didn't Musk said he will save $1 trillion or $2 trillion, and the fact that whatever you think about the inefficiency of government, the idea that there's like 1 or 2 trillions of stuff which is like just falling through the cracks is, I think, sort of a bit exaggeration over what's
Agree. There
really
may
happening.
be hundreds of billions in waste, but it's hard for me to imagine that there's trillions in waste. But the point is, we shouldn't just be focused on, obviously, waste is ridiculous. I mean, waste on top of an evil program. The thing is, though, when you ask people in polls, do you favor the elimination of now this is the Federal Department of Education, which doesn't educate anybody. It's private schools and public schools on the state level that educate people, but still you ask people in a poll, do you favor the elimination, and they say no. People seem to think that education would not occur without government involvement, or that somehow educational standards are being maintained despite now mind you, in the course of my entire life, the government spending on education per pupil or per taxpayer, depending on, no matter how you slice it, has gone up and up and up and up and up as the standards have gone down and down and down and down and down. Now it's like almost a scientific experiment in the fact that the more government gets involved, the worse government gets, the worse education gets. The more money we seem to spend, it's not a question question of money spent. And it's certainly to get an indicator that the more the government is involved, the worse the educational system seems to become. But most people still favor having a Department of Education. And that is what we really need to fight. We need to roll up our sleeves, get our boots on, and fight the idea that government should play any role at the state or federal level in education. That's really the moral point that needs to be made. Government has no right to force parents to send their kids to schools where they may or may not agree with what is being taught there. And that's what compulsory education laws do. They force parents to send their kids to schools where, and there's no way you can do education without expressing certain values. Even the value of mathematics or the value of science. There are maybe religious people who disagree with that. Now, I strongly disagree with them. But should parents ever be forced to send their kids to schools where they disagree with the curriculum, they disagree with the values that are being taught there, disagree with the content there? No. Should people who aren't even parents be forced to pay for the education of other people's children? No. So both tax-supported and compulsory education is wrong. And I will again cite the article in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal on public education. Compulsory tax-supported education is immoral. There is no reason for it. And the way the article poses the question, it's as though we lived in a socialist system where government provided all the shoes. And you said, well, let's get rid of the government shoemaking department. People would say, what? Do you want children to walk around barefoot? Do you want people to get injured feet? Because they're inevitably, of course, without government, there couldn't be shoes. But similarly, there's no question that there'd be education and better education if the government got the heck out of education altogether. Like anything else, the free market does it better. It provides wider choices, and the competition that would be involved would increase the quality of education rather than ever decreasing it as we spend more and more through government. Another article that I would urge people to read is an article by Ayn Rand called The Comparchicos, which talks about the effect of education on the young, how it distorts our minds. Now, there's a philosophical component to that. Philosophy, it's not just government involvement, it's the underlying philosophy, epistemology and pedagogy and philosophy of education that is so corrupted American education. Progressive education has destroyed American education. And then now in the wake of that, we're just living in a wasteland, in effect, of lower and lower and lower standards. We also think that we should just, the old George W. Bush's line, no child left behind. He encouraged more government involvement. And what has that meant? That we're not leaving children behind, we're giving them diplomas, only we're graduating effective illiterates who can't read or do basic math. That is a shameful thing. And people need to realize that it is the product of government involvement, and more than that, it is the philosophy of education that will determine the quality of that education. Ayn Rand has written about this extensively. And so I highly recommend both that article in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and Ayn Rand's article, The Comparchicos, which is in more than one anthology of her works. It's one of her best essays, one of her most powerful and moving essays, actually.
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And a super chat from the new Bronze Age collapse. He says, afuera, which was what Milei has been doing in Argentina. And on that race in the chat, his member says, Trump is trying so hard to be Milei by forcing things from the top down, not realizing US presidents have less power over their government than Argentinian presidents. I don't know how much that is true. I mean, the fact that Milei was able to just get rid of many departments would pretty much at that level sort of mean that. But also, U.S. presidents are probably the strongest executive in any sort of Western country. It's pretty much the only country that has this like really separate or sort of I think, James, you once used the term independent executive, which I never even thought of, but is basically what is independent from the legislature. This would be, because really no other system has anything like that. Pretty much all of Western democracies are parliamentary democracies, meaning the government, the sort of executive, and the parliament are very much intertwined. So the prime minister is the one who basically won the election almost always, which allows for,
There's an
yeah.
alignment already between the legislative and the executive branches that we do not have in the United States. The founding documents of our nation explicitly separated out executive functions from legislative functions, but you can't completely do that because simply in enforcing laws, if a cop, let me just give you this most simple example. A cop sees two crimes happening. One, someone's littering in the park. Two, there's an armed robbery across the street. Now, what is he supposed to do? He's got to make a decision that says the armed robbery is more important for me to go attend to than the guy who littered in the park. And there are these discretionary judgments. So there's a scope of discretion under any law in its application. And that is another layer of rulemaking. There's no question there's a kind of rulemaking that goes on in the executive branch within the scope of any law. And many of these programs were created quite independently of the department involved. So you still have to comply with the law and the program, and so they're moving the programs about. But they're also saying that the department itself was created by law, and at least Mr. Trump is saying that I can't do that without an act of Congress. Now, I say that with very mixed feelings. I much prefer a system with a filibuster. I much prefer a system of checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Even if I disagree with some of these court rulings that are slowing Trump down, I agree with some of these rulings from the courts that are slowing Trump down. It is the system itself that is more important. We need to preserve our constitutional system, even if that means sometimes things get slowed down that I would want to see happen or don't happen at all that I would want to see happen. As I say, it is the Democrats who should be thanking the filibuster because Trump does have looks like he's got a unified Congress on matters and can get stuff done. We've seen recent votes, even with his thin majority in the House of Representatives, he's still able to pass laws. They're sticking together. That's what Democrats used to be good at, sticking together and having a well-oiled machine. The Democrats appear to be splitting and falling asunder right now, while the Republicans are hanging together and trying to get stuff done. But for that filibuster, it may well be that the Department of Education would not have survived the year. That is to say, a lot of what Trump is doing, if he can enact it through Congress, makes the issue of his executive authority sort of irrelevant, because the Congress is now agreeing with the president in doing that. Of course, they still have the further check of the judiciary, courts, which can slow down or thwart, in some cases, if they're unconstitutional, what either Congress or the president are doing. They can thwart altogether some government policy by the elected branches. That's the American system. I like the American system. We've created far too powerful an executive. Over the years, presidents have done more and more through executive order because Congress is not doing their job and keeping up with policy changes as the people want policy changes to be enacted, for good or ill. But the system, to my way of thinking, is far more important to be protected than even a program that I really oppose, such as the Department of Education. And we also have a system where we divide powers between the state and the federal government. I don't like government involvement in education at all. Merely, quote, sending it back to the states is not getting at the moral issue about government involvement in education. That's what we really have to fight. And that's why I much prefer the idea that's been floated that any monies that they save in federal spending on education be sent directly to parents so that they can send their kids to private schools. Currently, the American tax-paying parent pays the full load for public education. Plus, if they want to send their kids to a private school, they have to pay the private school on top of that. That seems to me to be wrong. And so, again, when we're talking about phasing something out, school choice, vouchers for private schools with the aim in mind of eliminating public schools altogether as a mode of phasing out the government's involvement in education. That seems to be a good, in my view, a good way to go. That is to say, we must reduce the government's onerous involvement in it. You know, Illinois has recently passed a law that would dramatically reduce, for everyone who's homeschooled, the government is demanding in Illinois all this private information about the kids. And parents in Illinois are complaining. But this is what you get when you have compulsory education laws. The left would love to have indoctrination, leftist indoctrination, have all the children of all the conservatives out there come to government schools and get educated in environmentalism and socialism and inequality and so forth, and have their ideas propagated through the public school system, or even to influence the health of kids through the public school system. They want their policies, a wide range of policies, to be forced on parents through education. That is wrong. We need, in my view, a separation of state and education in the same way that we have a separation of religion and government in the United States. You know, the First Amendment to the Constitution says there should be no establishment of religion, nor should there be any prohibition of the free exercise of religion. It seems to me that any public education is, on the face of it, unconstitutional from my reckoning, because there's no way it's either going to be too secular, not secular enough, or too religious. Everyone's going to have a complaint on philosophical grounds when it comes to public education. And so for me, it is immoral for government to be deciding what ideology, what values to be teaching kids. That's just immoral on the face of it. As I say, you can't make someone pay for an educational system they don't agree with. That's wrong. But more than that, I think it's unconstitutional. From my reading of the Constitution, public education is a violation of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause on the face of it every time. Whether you have school prayer, for example, or don't have school prayer, whether you lead them in the Pledge of Allegiance or you don't lead them in the Pledge of Allegiance, whether you teach them evolution or you don't teach them evolution, you're making a philosophical value judgment the government has no business making. But that is inevitable with public education.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, just to sort of build upon, because you mentioned the left want to influence the children. It's also important to say conservatives would like that too. On state level, we've seen the sort of the banning of certain books, and trying to influence that in that regard. That's why even the idea that I think that was what the Trump said. He said it's going back to the state level where it belongs, is what he said. Well, it doesn't belong anywhere. I think I've also tried to sort of go through the Constitution and see it doesn't give the federal government any authority over education. Now, you know, if you do the hack of abusing general welfare clause, then you can like pretty much pass anything you want. But no,
It's under the Commerce Clause. That, believe it or not, that's how they've argued it for the Supreme Court. Now, that you have to throw out, starting in the 1930s, especially over the last 90 years, the Supreme Court has they overturned precedent, they overturned the original intention of the Commerce Clause altogether, and so they've reshaped what the meaning of the Commerce Clause is to the extent that it allows Congress to, in effect, have economic omnipotence. They can control their economic dictator. We have economic democracy in America, and the courts have changed dramatically. They had to overturn 140 years of precedent to change the meaning of the Commerce Clause and to expand it out of any recognition. So much of what our federal government is, the departments of education, commerce, energy, labor, all those departments are the product of this interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And it is un-American. It's not what the framers had written. It's not what the framers intended. They overturned over a century of precedent in doing it. But over the last 90 years, the Supreme Court has rewritten the Constitution such that you're absolutely right. They gave a specific list of limited powers to the federal government. Education is nowhere on that list. If they have to specify the post office, if they have to specify, counterfeiting laws, if they have to specify, the things that they do, then surely they did not mean to include education. Surely that is a violation of even just the original grant of power to Congress. But alas, the Supreme Court over the last 90 years, between the 1930s and the 1960s, it got really bad. From the 1990s forward, we've had, because of conservatives, a slight pullback in the meaning of the limitations in the Commerce Clause. But you're absolutely right. The right is no better. They would have school prayer. They would absolutely have, for example, and in fact, every kind of education that I would oppose, using the Bible as moral truth, for example, putting the Ten Commandments there, and say this is the moral truth, even if there is some moral value to the Ten Commandments, it is not the absolute writ that kids should be taught and, in effect, to worship. Conservatives would very much like to put their values, especially their religious values, into basic education, which I find abhorrent not only from the educational and governmental standpoint, but I myself, as an atheist, oppose it. But that shows a clear example there, shows how it is inevitable that public education has to take a stand on things like religion and moral values. And if that's the case, then any kind of public education, in my mind, is a violation of the Religious Establishment Clause.
Yeah, but also if you look at any sort of topic, and I told you a story about from my own education when we learn about the fascist state of Slovakia, or rather authoritarian state with fascist characteristics, because we cannot even handle establishing fascism, right? But the way sort of teacher spoke about it, and yeah, you need some values. You need to be able to spoke in some ways, especially something like history, especially things like the social studies you guys have now, which we thankfully did not have. But you need to have some, and you will put some philosophy through that. Someone I'm trying to read. Someone was asking like who can afford private education, 1 or 10%. Again, that's like people were using that when my country used to be communist. People used to say that about food, like, oh, if state stops being sort of involved in food, what will happen then? And the fact is, the food was terrible after communists. It was pretty much everything gave you cancer, and when we tried to, I think there was one story about when we tried to export food to America, and basically they wouldn't allow it because of American regulations, food regulations, because the food was actually bad. Like you could see that.
Well, the point there is, though, the government impoverishes people. The government makes education more expensive. For example, it is government subsidies to higher education that have made university education unaffordable for ordinary people. That is truly the case. It's the same with medical care. The more the government subsidizes, you've seen the price of smartphones go down, microwave ovens go down, computers go down. Well, that's the process of the free market. They cut costs, and competition drives down costs. And when you have government subsidies of education, it does the opposite. It drives the cost of education up. And so while we're spending more per pupil than ever before, and you look at the graph, the money spent per student has gone up, 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 up. The quality's gone down, 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 down. Now, if the government got really out of all the areas that it really shouldn't be involved in, the average American would be far richer. Prices would be much cheaper, and they wouldn't have the huge tax burden and inflation burdens that government creates on them. But poor people send their kids to even poor people in America send their kids to private schools. A lot of them, for example, are Catholic private schools in the United States. And Catholic schools run on a sliding scale of affordability. So the poorer you are, the less they charge. And there are a lot of ordinary people, the poor people. I would even classify the many of the students in American Catholic schools as being below the poverty level. So you ask yourself, who can afford private education? Well, many poor people in this country, even with all that I'm talking about, send their kids, poor families, send their kids to private Catholic schools in this country. With the COVID nonsense and the ridiculous shutting down of schools that happened during the lockdown, which so badly damaged kids psychologically, educationally, socially, it was a horrific thing what they did, shutting down schools, public or private schools were less affected because they didn't have all these other onerous rules on them. So homeschooling and private schools got a big shot in the arm when COVID happened, and there was an absolute shutdown. The teachers' unions, there should be no government unions at all for government, trade unions for government employees at all. That's a corruption right there. But we have teachers' unions. So the teachers in public schools have gotten together, and they opposed reopening the schools back in 2020 explicitly. I mean, kids weren't dying from COVID, but yet they shut down and onerously shut down all the public schools completely. So these poor kids, parents have, like I say, they have to pay the public. Education doesn't grow on trees. Ordinary Americans are already paying for education. And if the government wasn't involved in education, that would be a huge reduction in the cost of government on the state level in particular, but also on the federal level. And they would have the money to send their kids to private schools. But even with all that, as I say, because of the COVID lockdowns, many parents took their kids into private schools. And you saw an uptick in homeschool, a distinct uptick and rise in homeschooling and private schooling.
Yeah, and the fact is, who can afford public education? I mean, if you look at the cost of as you said, per pupil, how much it costs,
And
especially
if they're pumping out illiterates, why are we doing it at all? I mean, at the point is, who can afford education? Well, they're not getting an education. We're pumping out all manner of kids who can't do basic math or read a simple text. And so they're not getting education with public education. In fact, it's coming to the point where it's absurd. In some places, in some districts, a huge percentage of the kids are just functionally illiterate, and they're getting pushed through the system. That is an outrage. And the cost has gone up, 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 up. The tax burden on ordinary people. So as I say, you're paying for it. They used to say, if you think healthcare is expensive now, just wait till it's free. We're living in a system. You think private education is expensive now? Well, no. It's what you're paying for is the public education, and then if you want to send your kid to a private school, on top of that education, and the public cost part has gone up, 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 and so it's made it so that the affordability of education has gotten worse and worse and worse. If you want cheaper, that is to say, in terms of the value, education plus valuable education, what you want to do is get the government the hell out of education. That would make it more affordable for more people. Absolutely. It's just the reverse. When you say, who can afford education without public schools? You're paying for it now. You're paying for it through inflation. You're paying for it through taxes. That's what's happening.
Yeah, and also it's important to sort of say that fundamentally we are humans with free will and we choose what we want to do. If a kid doesn't want to learn something, there is no decree, there is no department you can create to sort of make them want. And that is the most important part. The fact that even when you look at private education like universities, America is in a terrible state when it comes to ideas. And private education is not some magic solution that, we make it private and now everything's fine. It will make it a bit better. It will sort of encourage more competition. It will encourage sort of more sort of even parent involvement about sort of getting their children
That
in
is
better
absolutely.
systems.
Oh boy, did you make a great point there. Parents, in effect, use the public schools as daycare. So as our economy gets worse, and both parents have to have jobs and stuff. Well, what do we do with the kids? We send them off to, in effect, to these publicly supported daycare centers that we call schools. That is a very, very important point. And where the worst schools are in America? One, inner city public schools, And two, the really elite private progressive schools, many of them have, because for purely philosophical reasons, because of the terrible ideas that dominate in our culture, some of the worst education. You'll get it done in a nice, clean classroom where the teacher can give attention to each of the students, but what they're teaching is god awful. So the worst schools, some of the worst schools, are private progressive schools that are very expensive to send your kids to. The other bad place, though, of course, obviously, are so many of our public school systems in this country are just pumping out, as I say, functional illiterates. Um, it's outrageous. There are districts, by the way. Let me just say, you can say that there are public school districts that do a much better job than other public school districts. And again, it is a matter. It's not a matter of how much money they spend per pupil. It is a matter of the quality of the education that they're getting because of the political systems that dominate those areas. And those public teachers unions are outright evil. They don't care about the health or education of the children. They're more concerned about their own jobs. And so they scream bloody murder. And so the head of the teachers union in America is saying, well, children are going to go around, all these children are, it's going to get worse from here. And now I can't imagine things going in a worse trajectory in education than they're currently going at the moment. You'd think that that set of facts would slap people across the face and realize that what we've been doing is a disaster. We have to do a radical course change if we want to improve education in America. And doing it the government way has been a failure. And the more we spend per pupil, the worse the outcomes.
Yeah, and we really need to encourage sort of the independence in people, and yeah, wanting to do things privately, wanting to do things independently of the government. Government is not some magical solution that, well, we'll just get government involved. That's why, when it comes to my own country, I've been looking into, because we have a certain minority in Slovakia, the Roma population, which also have like a problem when it comes to education access, when it comes to pretty much anything doing with education. And government has been terrible at solving it. And what is actually solving that thing is private companies, is private NGOs or similar organizations, basically going into those let's say the villages that they don't even have property rights over them, that are basically sort of just slums, and trying to like really pull out the kids out of there and get them some quality education, get them something better. And that's always what happens. That's why you always see the actual solutions coming from the private industry, because even when the government does something and government manages to do something well, it is because there are capable individuals in those positions, and those same individuals could be somewhere much more productively. I mean, people have been talking about Elon Musk and his involvement in the government. And I've recently started looking into Starlink. And that thing is incredible. The guy shouldn't be in government. Like, any sort of good and capability Elon Musk has is wasted on the government, and really shouldn't have anything to do with that, and should be private. Um,
I have to agree that, and there's a principled point here that we have to make. Ayn Rand said it. Just as there's a separation of church and state, socially there should be a separation of church or state and economics. And I would just apply that in this case in a narrower way, a separation between state and education. It involves both the church element of ideology, but also the economics element. But for the exact same reason that we have separation of church and state in the United States, we should have a separation of government and education for the exact same reason.
Someone says K through 12 should be teaching only STEM, maybe civics, music, but that's about it. I think civics should 100% be something that should be even under private education, especially in America. I think the fact that most people don't even understand the system itself, or have never even read the Constitution, which is super short. Like, you can go through it through one sitting very easily, like understanding, even going through amendments, even going through Declaration of Independence. It's super easy, yet people do not actually know how the system itself works. And I think it's very important to sort of understand the system that you're living in, just so we don't start shooting each other. The purpose of a system is both to be somewhat rigid, so we have things don't radically change from one day to another, but also allow for change. So again, some people don't feel like, well, I cannot change anything, so let's just start
Well, I don't
shooting
think
each
there
other.
should be a rule about K through 12 and what they teach. I
Well,
think
yeah,
the parents should decide what the curriculum of their kids are. And so long as government is deciding the curriculum, then we're going to have some dispute. I happen to go to a school that did have all kinds of other programs apart from learning, math and history and science. The school that I went to had other kinds of programs that I absolutely benefited from. And I'm absolutely glad they had those other programs. But that should be up to the parents. Now, I do believe that there's a core correct curriculum that is objective, that all young kids need to go through. And here I'm going to recommend Dr. Leonard Peikoff's course, A Philosophy of Education, where he goes through precisely that. What is the necessary, what are the necessary principles of early pedagogy? And that involves developing a conceptual mind. And there he does develop a sort of core curriculum that absolutely has to be necessary, to which other things I think are optional. But if the parents are involved, like my parents were involved in my education, they cared. They very much cared about the quality. They moved, if necessary, to get to a good school for their kids, for me and my siblings. And that shouldn't be what they have to do. You shouldn't have to move from one district to another to have parental choice about what school you send your kids to. But the curriculum, what the kids are taught, should be a function of the parents' decision on that. And I'm absolutely convinced that when you live in a free society, the rational has the tendency to win. And I think better and better schools, through competition and freedom of choice, would prevail at the end of the day. I think most people want their kids to be educated. They don't want them to be, hobbled in their life from getting a good job. No, they want their kids to be able to be functional, and to have functional brains, and to have the best opportunities and choices for their careers. That means teaching their kids. But the government gives them an easy out, gives them this public babysitter that's, oh, well, aren't they educating? So the parents don't even really have to think about it. We know the government's doing it for us. People, you got to get that mentality out of your head. There is nothing the government does that you can just, put on autopilot and say, let the government do it. No, no. And education is like the most important thing. If I was going to even rank the things the government is involved in that they ought not to do, and ordinary people should take the reins of control themselves on, its education.
yeah. Just to clarify, when I said, it should be done, it means if I ever have a kid, you bet they are getting some civic education.
Yeah.
But someone says the next question is what to do when parents have no clue. I mean, that is a recipe for a dictatorship. If you do not believe individuals have a ability to take control of their life and of the people they have to take care of, then the Western civilization is going to collapse. Like if you do not believe that people have ability to control their life, then we cannot really do anything. And there is no solution to that. Like, do you think those same people that cannot educate their children can like pick politicians who would actually, introduce systems that would
Well,
be
see,
beneficial?
no, but the point is that you've got a rotten parent who doesn't care. You've got the rotten parent under public education who doesn't care. And that is a far bigger indicator. See, even in the worst of public schools, if the parent doesn't care, their odds of getting a lousy outcome are still there. Why do you think we're pumping out illiterates? Because even with a public education system, if the parent doesn't care, it's going to have a bad result. That's going to be true whether it's public education or not. Public education doesn't improve the context for a kid who has a parent who doesn't care about education. If the parent doesn't care about education, you could triple the education public budget. We have compulsory education. You have to send your kids to some kind of school. And if you're a lousy parent who doesn't care about education, whether or not a public school system exists, it's going to negatively impact the kid. If the parent does care, then again, even if they're in a lousy public school, the educational outcomes are different. Caring parents, the public education doesn't fix the problem of needing a parent who cares about the education. Because even with a public education system, a lousy parent will probably result in a lousy educational outcome for the kid. It's not the school that fixes that problem. It's neither compulsory education laws that require them to be educated, nor is it public supported, tax supported public schools being made available that fixes the problem. It's not the availability. It's not forcing them into schools. The lousy parent is a much more important overarching factor, which will have negative outcomes for education, whether we have public schools or not. So the premise of that question is just wrong. Parents who don't give a hell about their kids, you're going to have rotten outcomes, whether you've got public education or not. Promise. You have parents who care, even if they're poor parents, you'll have much better outcomes. And the data shows that overwhelmingly.
Yeah, and also we need to, like, people need to be independent and need to be responsible and need to own up to the choices they make. I some time ago I started looking into getting private insurance because the healthcare in Slovakia is not ideal, especially if you get disabled or anything. And so now I'm pretty much I'm good, whatever happens. But I oftentimes hear, something in America saying like this person had to pay so much for medical and they had no insurance. And my immediate reaction, why did you have no insurance? It's like saying, well, what do we do when someone doesn't want to work for their life and they starve to that? And it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like, you need to take responsibility over your life. Like, that needs to happen. We cannot solve for free will. We cannot solve for someone not
No.
wanting to take
And
responsibility of their life.
taking away the negative consequences from parents only makes it worse. That is to say, the existence of public schools encourages irresponsible parenting. I will repeat that. The very existence of public schools encourages parental irresponsibility. It is not the government's job to educate your kids any more than it's the government's job to feed your kids, put shoes on your kids, make sure they, go to the doctor and get their vaccines. No, it's up to the parent to do that. Now, won't get into, certain things are child abuse, and the government should step in when there is physical harm being done to kids. Absolutely. But when it comes to the mental state of the kids, the government must stay out. They have no business taking ideological or value stances, because that's imposing it from on high from the government and forcing, and to the extent, as I say, that you even have these public schools, you encourage irresponsibility about education and parenting. These questioners' premises are precisely backwards. The more government is involved, the worse the outcomes. That's just a general rule that you can take to the bank, my friends.
Just quickly, someone says, if parent completely control the choice and the child knew better what the child's option, then, I guess we're talking only about like 13, 14, 15 or something like that, when child can sort of know better. In certain extreme cases, they can ask the government to basically take away the parents' responsibility over them if they believe they are sort of being abused, or really they are able to take care of themselves and parents are stampering it. Now, maybe there might be, I think, some, I'm wondering, what do you think, some sort of basic sort of, if you let's say you have a child and you refuse to like talk to them, so they never even develop language, I think that could be, and maybe something similar when it comes to like really basic education, like sort of being able to think conceptually, or being able to like have the basic sort of thinking, I think might amount to abuse, and government might be able to step in.
I
But
agree.
then it would mean completely removing the child from the parent's life, not some sort
Exactly.
of, there is this thing where you have to go to.
If it reaches the point of that kind of abuse and hobbling of a child, if they're unable to speak, for you, great example there. But who on earth raises their children like wolves would, where they have to sort of, it really is examples of children being raised in the wild by wild animals or something, where you have to reach for that extreme kind of an example. I am confident that most parents would want their children to have as good a basic education as possible. And of course, there comes a point where children are declaring their psychological and intellectual independence from their own parents and families, which is a perfectly healthy thing as they enter in their teens. You know, you can, like me, you can come from a family that takes you to church, and when you're 12 years old, say, hey, no, I reject the idea of God and religion. And I could still learn in a system that I could still, and in fact, I could still learn from my parents, by the way. Despite that, that's not the kind of subtle difference between parents and kids that the government should be involved in at all. It should be parental choice. They're the ones responsible for the raising of the kids. And yeah, at the extreme where it becomes child abuse, clearly physical abuse or some kind of complete mental hobbling of the child, yes, the government should be able to step in.
We have a super chat from Inaka R. She says, why was John Adams personally pro-public education?
Well, I can explain that. He believed that, and he explained it himself, he believed that an educated electorate was necessary to sustain the republic. I agree. We need an educated electorate. That is why I urge the elimination of public schools. He was wrong. The founding fathers didn't get everything right. Let me just say that there are mistakes and contradictions in the U.S. Constitution. This is not one of them because there's no federal role for education. But John Adams, if he, insofar as he advocated public schools, you know what he was advocating for too. He was advocating for the kind of schools that, Congregationalists in New England at that time were giving their kids. In some ways, it may have been a better education than kids are getting today, but in my view, not an ideal one either. But his basic point is correct. We need, without an educated electorate, a republic cannot survive. That puts in italics why the government should get out as soon as possible of the whole field of education. I agree with his ultimate conclusion that we need an educated electorate for a healthy society. Absolutely. That's why John Adams believed in education. But that is the very reason why I oppose public education. They need real education. They don't need the mental hobbling one way or another that they're getting from public education today. Public education is an outright failure. Like every other government program that goes beyond, say, the law enforcement, national defense, the courts, once government steps out of its properly limited functions, look at all the programs that you want. And I will double dog dare you and defy you to find one that was effective instead of making it much worse. And the two, as I say, the two things that most come to mind are healthcare and education. And in America, we have an almost scientific way of looking at it. The more the government has involved itself in healthcare and education, the higher the cost, the less affordable that is for the ordinary person, and the worse the outcomes in a way. Now, if it weren't for scientific development, scientific progress in medicine, and that has improved. I mean, we have treatments and medicines today that we never had before. But a lot of that, again, is private research from pharmaceutical companies or at the university level research, at least. But when we have government involvement in education to educate kids that way, there's not even that. It's not even though I could say that there's been some scientific advance which has dramatically improved education, like I can in medicine. But both in healthcare and in education, we get worse outcomes, we get lower affordability, the situation becomes more expensive, and the quality of outcome gets worse. So if you care about getting the public educated to improve our society, and I benefit from a more educated populace. I have very selfish reasons to want more Americans to be better educated, believe me. But that stresses why the government has to get out of the education business.
Okay, we have to wrap up, but first,
Okay.
Inaka, thank you for your super chat. She is asking, is there advantage of public education department for new immigrants? Maybe if they get access or anything, I don't know how that is handled. Usually,
For
the
legal
schools are
immigrants,
handled to the
well, it's
local.
very interesting. For legal immigrants, obviously, they have the same availability for public education as everyone else. But even in most jurisdictions, public education is available for the children of undocumented immigrants in the United States, although it is under Trump, it is increasingly dangerous for undocumented people to send their kids to public schools for obvious reasons. But the public school systems generally in this country provide education regardless of your citizenship status.
And with that, thank you, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of The Daily Objective. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.